First, let's go over this at warp speed for later reference, then we'll slow it down and give you the deeper explanations. The theme we're changing to flatty light as a jumping off point, then the low gradient colour gets tweaked, and then the high gradient colour. Then there's the transparent sidebars with the region overlap. To get the full benefit, we'll tweak the theme region alpha value. Let's take it right down. Make the text a touch bigger with the DPI value around 85 or 90 or so. That's despite having my eyes lasered, but I still just prefer slightly better readability. Then we have the compute device set to CUDA. On the interface tab, we have auto perspective set, and we also have auto depth enabled. Just a few add-ons we mention here. One is the Layer Manager add-on, the Node Wrangler add-on, and also the Import Images as Planes add-on. In the scene itself, we're switching to GPU compute, and therefore the tile sizes get increased. We up the start resolution, and thanks to Troy Sobotka, we now have filmic display values to play with. Blender is incredibly customizable, and as a beginner it can be sometimes surprising at best and confusing at worst to see another version of Blender that is looking and behaving differently to their own. While as tutorial creators we keep those changes to a minimum, there are definitely some things you need to know about to get the most out of Blender. What those changes are and why Gleb and I and many more Blender users for that matter make those changes is what I want to share with you in this video. Hi, 80 Boris here, and this is a bonus setup video from the Space VFX Elements series by myself and Gleb Alexandrov. Aside from user preferences, when we start a scene there are several things we almost always change. I want to go over these changes here and explain the what and the why, so it's all in one handy reference video. This might be pretty tedious setup stuff and suck like a black hole, but stay strong, we can get through this and come out the other side all pure light and ready to launch. What we're going to need to do is open up our user preferences, so we can go File and then User Preferences, or we can just use the shortcut Control-Alt-New. When we do that though, we kind of get this separate window, and I kind of want to keep everything focused on the same window, so instead of doing that I'm going to close it and left click and drag from the top right and just split the window here. And instead of this being a 3D view, I'm going to switch to user preferences. So now we can start making changes, and the mouse is always focused on this version of Blender basically. So we have these tabs at the top, and we want to come over to the themes tab, and we have this presets pull down menu, and in here we can switch our theme. So sometimes when I'm going for a darker look, I'll choose this Elysian, and you can see we get quite a drastic change there. But lately I've been using this flatty light theme. Now the gradient in the 3D view is a little bit different there. So what I'm going to do is just make sure we've got 3D view selected here. And now on the right hand side we can kind of change whatever values we want to do with the 3D view. So I'm going to middle click and drag down. And right at the bottom we're using our gradient. The gradient low, I'm just going to lean that towards blue and maybe step that up to something like this. And then on the high gradient, let's turn that much brighter, something like this. And then again, just lean it slightly into the blue. But as with these things, it's all preference really. At the bottom of the user preferences, we've got these options here. We can reset back to the default theme. We can install a theme that you might have customized yourself or found online. And we can also save our user settings. So whatever settings we change in here, if we don't click on this save user settings, when we reopen Blender, it'll be back to how it was before. So if we just click on this, we'll save the changes we've made here. Just to be clear, that's the changes to the flatty light theme. To have our own custom theme, we click on the plus icon and name that whatever you like. The actual location that you'll find this custom theme, if you're on Windows at least, will be at this location. Then you can copy that to any version of Blender. So what we're going to do is come over to the System tab this time to start this off. And then over here we have Region Overlap. We're going to need to make sure that this option is enabled. And to really have this a little bit more transparent, we're going to need to come right back over to the themes again. Under 3D view, we middle click and drag down so that we can see the region area, the region back. Let's just click on this, and I'm just going to take down the alpha value a little bit further. So something like that. Then let's middle click and drag back up, and then come over to our final system change here to do with the way that Blender looks overall, is just to set the DPI. Usually this is a little bit lower so that you're going to get smaller writing. Well, I just kind of like bumping this up a little bit and just making everything just a tiny bit more readable. Although I don't really have an excuse because I had my eyes lasered about 6 years ago. My eyes are actually pretty good, but still I like the text a little bit larger. So that's it for the visual changes. Next up, let's talk a little bit more about some of the more stealthy changes. So if we come up to the top and switch from Blender Render to Cycles Render, we can come over to here. Let's just give this a little bit more room, and we can set our device to speed up our rendering by taking advantage of the GPU. The thing is, we need to make sure first that in the System tab of the User Preferences, we've set our compute device to CUDA in this case. If this was set to none, you'll notice that option goes away. So we need CUDA to be set there, and then that enables us to be able to get hold of our GPU compute. Next, let's talk about something in the Interface tab. So we'll switch over to there and then come down to this Auto Perspective option. Now by default, I believe this is unchecked. And what this is referring to is whether we're in perspective or orthographic modes. Without it on, what's going to happen is it's not going to switch this. It's not going to do it automatically. So if I press 1 on the numpad to switch to front view, it's going to keep us in perspective. If I press 7 on the numpad to move to top view, still we're in perspective. We need to use the 5 key on the numpad to be able to toggle between perspective and orthographic. That also means if I'm in orthographic view like this from the top and then I start to pivot around, you can see we're still in orthographic view. We get these kind of lines that are never going to converge as we would do if we had our foreshortening taking place with a perspective view. So this auto perspective, if we enable this option and then press 1 on the numpad to switch to front orthographic view, now if we middle click and rotate outside of that, it's going to assume that we want to jump into a perspective view, which is almost always the case when personally I'm doing this. Also, when we switch to the top view now, so I'll press 7 on the numpad, it's going to assume that we want to look at orthographic view, which again is pretty much always the way I like to look at it. So this option, if nobody else likes this was just made for me apparently. But really, I feel like this makes quite a lot of sense intuitively on how you want to navigate around and switch between views. So I definitely recommend having this on. The last option that I'd like to talk about in the Interface tab of the User Preferences is this Auto Depth option. Now if we just hover over and read the tooltip, it says that it's going to use the depth under the mouse to improve the view's pan, rotate and zoom functionality, which is a really good description of what it's going to do. So if we just take this cube, press Shift-D to duplicate it, and then press Y to constrain it along the Y-axis, and now let's just chuck it over there by left-clicking and dropping that down. Now without this option, if we uncheck that auto depth, if we try and now rotate around or move over or whatever navigation we want to try and do to get over here, we're going to struggle. So we're going to need to use the view selected option, and the shortcut for that is the period on the numpad or the full stop, depending on what you want to call it. So once we've done that, we've swung over and now we've kind of reset the camera. So we're rotating right around this cube now, and it's going to be easy to zoom into this or away from it. But if we want to come back over to that original cube, we kind of have to be a little bit more like Spider-Man and just select it, swing over with the period on the numpad, and then we can carry on moving. Well, this option here is going to kind of remove that step, so we can select this auto depth here, and now wherever the cursor is, if we middle click and hold Control to try and zoom into this thing, as long as that cube is right under our cursor, we can kind of do this. We can Control and middle click, and we can see we're completely zooming over really nice and quick. So we didn't need to select it and then zoom into it at all, but yet here we are rotating nicely around it. This is an especially good option for larger environments that you might be working on, ironically, like a Spider-Man game. Again, for Blender to remember our changes, we need to remember to click on our Save User Settings. Next, let's come over to the Add-ons tab, as we're going to be talking about add-ons, or plugins as they may be called in other applications. If you don't know already, add-ons basically give Blender more tools or additional capability in some way, many of them written by the community. In short, these are awesome and well worth your time exploring and testing these out. We have several add-ons enabled by default. So let's come over to our categories that we see on the left hand side. In fact, let's pull this over so we have a little bit more space here. So we have filters on the left hand side and the results of those filters on the right hand side. Now currently we're looking at the supported level of official and community level add-ons, but if we hold Shift and click on testing, we're now going to include more incomplete add-ons that might be bundled with Blender within this list. We're also seeing all of them since our category is all, but we could actually just filter that down to say, let's just take a look at the ones that we have enabled already. So there's not a massive amount that we have enabled already, but it does give you an idea as to the sort of things that might come as a surprise that is actually running as an add-on. For example, like the Cycles rendering engine is even an add-on. Now right now, all I really want to talk about is 3 add-ons that aren't enabled by default. So let's get into it. The The first I'd like to take a look at is the layer management add-on. So let's set our categories back to all, and we'll filter this out a little bit by using our text box at the top here. I'm just going to type in layer. And then on the right hand side, we've got anything with the word layer in it, and layer management is exactly what we want. I have this checked already, but if it's not, then just click on the little box there to enable it. And then if we just click on that little triangle there to pull down some more information, you can see that this is for the 3D view. It's going to show up in the tool shelf under the layers tab. So let's just give ourselves a little bit more space in the 3D view. Let's come over to our tool shelf, which I'm sure we all know by now is the T key. And then here we've got the layers. And we can just click on our layer management pull down there, and I'm just going to just talk about this for a moment. So here's all our 20 layers that you get in Blender, and these are the very same layers that you get down here. This add-on is going to give us an opportunity to write down a little bit about what's going on in each layer basically. So in this one we might just have the sun, in this one we might have some geometry that we wanted to keep, and this one might be safety backup stuff. Whatever the case may be, this is going to allow us to come back to this same blend file in a few months time and then go, aha, this is what I was using that layer for. There's some other cool things that you can do with this, which is just to hide all those empty layers. So anything that isn't being used, it just kind of cleans up the view a little bit. And we've also got some other options here. For example, this little arrow here will select everything that happens to be in that layer, and we can even toggle the draw type to be wireframe for objects in that layer too. But for now, that's all we really need to know about this add-on. The next add-on we should have a look at is the Node Wrangler add-on. And as the name may suggest, we're going to need to be out of the 3D view and in instead the node editor. So let's click that over there, press N to close out that properties sidebar, and then let's click on use nodes so that we actually get some nodes in the scene. Now let's just pull the windows this way a little bit as we take a look back in the add-ons list, and let's take out the layer filter. So we'll just delete that text and instead come down to the node category, which we have this time, or we could have just typed in node there. There's only really the one, this Node Wrangler add-on. I already have this enabled, as you can see, and there's also this hotkey that we can click on, this show hotkey list, and there's a whole load of hotkeys in there. Let's move our screens back over a little bit, split it by left clicking and dragging from the top right there, and we'll switch this back to a 3D view. And with this cube selected, let's go Shift Z to switch to rendered view basically. And now we can see what this shader is doing. It's just a diffuse shader going into its material output. Now what we can do with this shader selected, we can go Control T, and that will auto-generate this image texture node, and then also hook it up to some vector nodes for us so that it knows where to place it. Also, I'm going to switch this out to something else. So as we can see down at the bottom here, we've got this switch node type. I'm going to go Shift S, so Shift S, and then I'm going to switch that texture node to a noise texture instead, and we can see something changed there. Now if we want to really get a clear look at what this is actually doing without any shading on it, what we can do is go Control Shift and left click. That's this Connect to Cycles Viewer node, and that's very reminiscent of what we would do in our Scenes node over here. If we used our nodes and we were to Control Shift click on this, we get this Viewer node. I'm just going to uncheck that though and switch back over to Material nodes. The little green Viewer node there is simply a collapsed emission shader. You can toggle whether it's collapsed by selecting it, and any node for that matter, and pressing H. You can see it's basically just plugging whatever node that we Control Shift click on. It's going to hook that up to this viewer, this emission shader, and then just put that into the surface output. And then when we're finished with it, we can just Control Shift click on our diffuse shader again, and it kind of cleans that all up for us. So one more super useful add-on is the Import Images as Planes add-on. Now basically this is just going to allow us to bring in some external image onto a mesh plane that we can then place in the background of our scenes. But the cool thing about this is it just does it in one click and preserves the ratio of the image. So let's just take a quick look. Let's scroll up this to the top and let's change our categories to all. Let's use the text filter again. Let's type in here just images, and then there's our Import Images as Planes add-on. And you can see in the description, the location rather, that we've got File, Import, and then we should find it there. So let's go File, as it suggests, Import, Images as Planes is there. So when we click on this, find the folder that you want with the image inside, and then I'm just going to click on this here. The add-on does have some extra options here, but I'm just going to ignore all these. In fact, one thing to note is that it does detect whether we're in Cycles or Blender Internal. We're in Cycles already, so we're just going to use this, and it's going to set it up to a diffuse shader. Let's set that up to an emission shader instead. So let's just make that one quick tweak. Now we'll import images as planes. Let's just open up the difference between the outliner here, and there's our image. Let's press the period on the numpad, or the full stop, depending on what you want to call it, and then we can delete this cube that's in the way. Select our image plane. Let's go Shift Z to take a look. And there it is. There's our image that we've just brought in. And as you can see, it wasn't a square image. It's preserved the ratio of everything really nicely. And you can see the shader here. It's very basic. And there's our image texture that it's using. And it's all as simple as that. So there are obviously many more add-ons, and I would encourage, as I say, to go through all these and take a look at what you might be able to use, and maybe it'll be able to speed up your workflow. There are many more online as well that you can download. For now, that's all we really want to take a look at. Now let's take a look at some typical setting changes that you might make to your Blender scene every time we start. And that would be a scene in cycles. So let's switch over to the cycles rendering engine. And if we're using cycles, we can get the most power out of that with the material nodes. So let's left click and drag from the top right there, split the view. Let's just set one of them to the node editor, and let's set this to use nodes. And if we zoom in a little bit, we can see we have our default diffuse shader connected to the material output. So now that we're using cycles, we can come over to our rendering settings, which should have some cycles related stuff going on inside here now. And the device, I'm going to change from CPU to GPU since this graphics card is compatible. So we'll get a little bit of a speed up there. Now if we come down to the bottom, because we've set that to GPU, we can find our performance area and just open that up, and we can see our tile sizes. Now the tile sizes, if we hit F12 to render, the tile size is this little orange square which is darting around and creating our render for us. And the time it takes for me to render this on the GPU is 5.84 seconds. Now if I set the tile sizes way up, so I'm going to left click and drag across the both and set them up to 512, and then hit number 2 to change to slot number 2, and then hit F12 to render again. The tile size is a whole lot bigger, and you can see the render time has gone down to 3.15 seconds. Now let's press 1 again to toggle between slot 1 and 2. All the numbers above the QWERTY keyboard there are going to show us our slots, so I'm just going to press number 1 and 2, and you can see we can toggle between the two. So let's escape out of our rendering there and hit Shift Z to switch to our rendered view. And now if we middle click and drag around the scene, you can see initially as Cycles is constructing our scene for us, it's a little bit on the jaggy side. In fact, we can really crank that effect up by changing the start resolution here to say 12, and then let's pivot around the scene again. You can see how blocky it becomes. So if we set this up quite high, like 256 or 512, overall it's much smoother as we move around. But we might find we need to lower that as our scene becomes more complex. Now something that we can actually do is go to File and then save this as a startup file if you like, and that way every time you open up Blender this will become your default scene. The last thing I should probably make sure to include in this video is a little mention of what's currently called Filmic Blender. This is pretty new stuff, and it's likely that it will become really quite straightforward to set up and use in Blender 2.79 and up. So what is it and why do we care? Put simply, it's going to make the colours and light behave more realistically. So what does that actually mean? Well, in this scene, I've just got two planes. This plane has a diffuse shader on it set to blue, and this one's got a green diffuse shader on it. Now I've got a lamp in the scene, which is just a sun lamp, and currently it's just a white and it's a strength of 5. So with Filmic Blender, you're probably going to want to increase the strength of lights that you have in your older scenes. And also you'll notice that the brighter we make this, the more desaturated the colors become. Instead of the current default behavior, if you tried that, you would probably notice that things get even more saturated and probably change hue quite a bit too. So this Filmic Blender is going to give us some different settings in our color management. And if we check out our look area, we've got a completely different sort of list than what the kind of Instagram filters we had before. And it's base contrast, which is going to be the most similar to what we've been used to. So as I say, I'm hoping it'll be more straightforward in future versions of Blender, that this will be included already. However, right now, all you need to do is to install it is download it from Troy Sobotka's GitHub page. You can easily find it by typing in Blender Filmic into Google. Troy is the color wizard and super nice person who has put this together for the benefit of the Blender community. So massive thanks go out to Troy, of course. So what do we need to do here? Well, once we're on the page, we need to come over to the clone or download, hit the download zip. Once that is downloaded, find that zip file and extract it into a folder. Once you have it extracted, select that folder, copy it, Go over to where you have your current version of Blender installed, go to the data files, and then we'll find this color management folder. What we're going to do is just rename this to color management _old. Let's hit continue, paste to paste in our folder that we extracted, the Filmic Blender. And then what we want to do is rename that to color management and then hit enter. And that's all we need to do. The color management _old is simply a backup in case you come across any problems. But now if we close Blender and restart it again, you'll find a lot of the color management options have now been updated to include this Filmic log encoding base under the Scenes tab of our Properties window. And that, Space Travelers, is all we need to begin our adventures. Thanks very much for joining us on this quick setup tutorial in the Space VFX Elements series by Gleb Alexandrov and me, 80 Burrows.